Bonjour and welcome back to the history of the United States since 1877. The previous section focused more on the international developments of US history in the early 20th century. We focused on two things: US involvement in the Caribbean, such as Panama and Cuba, as well as US involvement in Europe during World War I. This period marked a high watermark that was unprecedented for US involvement, a country that used to be quite inward-looking previously. George Washington, in his farewell address, had famously warned Americans against foreign entanglements, to become entangled in European affairs. Well, this had changed completely under President Woodrow Wilson, who had happily jumped into the fray. Initially, Americans had followed him happily, but then by the end of World War I, there is a sense of fatigue with constant wars in the Caribbean and Europe. The sense that over 100,000 Americans had died in World War I, and then when the Versailles Treaty was signed, not much had changed. The hope for a generous peace was not fulfilled. Also a sense that war in Europe had led to a degradation of civil liberties at home, with the passage of the Espionage Act and of the Sedition Act. The ability of Americans to criticize the government, to have the privacy of their mail, or to publish what they want in the paper had been curtailed severely. And so there is kind of a backlash against that outside interventionism by 1919-1920. Famously, the Versailles Treaty, which Woodrow Wilson had negotiated while being in Paris, had to be ratified when he brought back to the United States. Under the Constitution, the Senate is responsible for ratifying the Versailles Treaty. And there was such a backlash against World War I that the Senate failed to muster the two-thirds majority, and the United States never ratified that treaty. One element of that treaty was the creation of the League of Nations, which is the ancestor of today's United Nations, and as a result of not ratifying that treaty, the United States did not join the League of Nations. It's a good example of the isolationism that came to characterize US politics in the 1920s and 1930s. And that's kind of a long introduction to explain that the next section will not be about foreign policy, but more about internal developments. Today we will start with the 1920s, a period dominated by conservative Republican presidents. Woodrow Wilson finished his second term in 1920-21, and by the end of that he was quite incapacitated. He had suffered a stroke and was unable to do much. In the 1920 election, the person that won would be a Republican, so he was switched from Democratic to Republican majorities, and his name was Warren Gamaliel Harding, and he was one of the many presidents who came from the state of Ohio. When he campaigned for president in 1920, he said that he wanted to achieve normalcy, and the journalists were a bit struck by it, wondering what is normalcy. He was not in the dictionary, and they figured that he meant normality, for things to go back to normal. Well, what is normal according to Harding? Well, it's whatever existed before World War I, before the Progressive Era. So going back to more of the conservative small government ethos of the Gilded Age, where there should be no progressive reforms, no telling people what to do, small taxes as much as possible. And overseas, it also meant going back to the more isolationist view of US foreign policy that had been the norm in the 19th century. So no more interventions in the Caribbean, and definitely no interventions in Europe. And that also meant that all the intrusion that the federal government would have in people's affairs during World War I, with the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, the curtailing of civil liberties, that would have to come to an end. A very famous case was that of Eugene V. Debs. We encountered him before. He was a leading member of the Socialist Party in the early 20th century. And as such, he had criticized World War I when the United States had entered World War I. He wanted to remain at peace, which was within his right of free speech to say. But World War I, there was such a limitation of civil liberties that the government had punished him, even sent him to federal prison just because he had spoken up against World War I. When Harding became president, he pardoned Debs and got him out of prison. Not because any kind of affinity, politically speaking. Harding is a conservative Republican. Debs was on the far left of the political spectrum. But Harding was committed to the notion of free speech, which is enshrined in the First Amendment to the Constitution, and you should let even your enemies say what they want without punishing him through the government. So the policies of Harding overseas would be marked by isolationism, which means simply to stay out of people's affairs. The Versailles Treaty, as I mentioned, was not ratified by the Senate, and so the major foreign policy development during the presidency of Harding would be the passing of the Washington Disarmament Conference Agreement. This was a conference that gathered up in Washington, D.C., in case you haven't noticed, and this was about naval disarmament. There are the major naval powers in the world, countries like the US, Britain, France, Italy, Japan, gathered and agreed to severely limit the number of capital ships, big battleships and cruisers that they had. Germany was not invited. Remember that under the Versailles Treaty, Germany is not supposed to have a high seas fleet at all. So this was sponsored by Harding in the United States, but notice that this is all about disarmament, reducing the size of international navies, the goal being to avoid the kind of naval arms race that had led to World War I. So even though the US is involved in foreign policy, it's really to limit the risk of a foreign war and limit the risk that the US would have to enter that foreign war. So it's really an isolationist kind of an attempt. Yeah, that when it comes to local politics, you have a return to small government, and that would be quite striking. Harding mostly campaigned from the porch of his house back in Marion, Ohio. And when he became president, he tried to do as little as he could because, well, that's what the Republican Party, the conservatives, were about, to have small government. So just stay out of people's affairs, don't pass major laws. Harding has a poor reputation among historians today. Presidential historians every year or so will gather up and have a poll who they think was the best president ever and the second best and third and so forth. And usually Lincoln or Washington or Kennedy or Franklin D. Roosevelt will top the list. And towards the bottom of that list, usually you will have Warren Harding, which I think is a bit unfair towards him. He's not a terrible president, it's just that he does little. There's also a sense that he was intellectually a bit limited. On the plus side, he was aware of that. He himself understood that he was not the smartest bulb in the room, which to me is a sign of intelligence when you're aware of your own stupidity. Specifically, there's a time when he was looking at a tax issue, and he was talking with one of his advisors, and he just erupted saying, "Oh, I can't make sense of that tax issue. I listened to one expert and they tell me one thing and I'm convinced, and then I listen to another expert and he tells me the opposite and I'm convinced as well. And I can't make up my mind or understand what the whole issue is about. God, what a job." So ultimately, he is mostly known for his less savory aspects in office. For example, he had a mistress who lived a few blocks away from the White House, and he fathered a love child while in office. Also, when he came from Ohio to Washington, D.C. as president, all his buddies from Ohio came along thinking, well, that's a great opportunity to make money. My best friend is not president of the United States. So his whole administration was surrounded by a cloud of scandal. You have a lot of bribery schemes. The most famous of them was the Teapot Dome scandal, Teapot Dome being a place in Wyoming where the US government would own some federal land, and on that land was quite a bit of oil, or underneath that land, I guess. The idea had been to save that oil aside as a strategic reserve for the Navy. If the US ever got involved into another conflict, then you would have oil that just had to be drilled and would be ready to power American ships. But the friends of Warren Harding saw it otherwise and thought, let's drill, let's get that oil out and make a quick buck. So to do so, they paid bribes to the right people, and eventually that scandal erupted and tainted the administration. Notice that the presidency of Harding, however, is a bit short. Elected in 1920, inaugurated in 1921, and did not do his full 4-year term because in 1923 he went to the West Coast, and if I remember the story right, when visiting Alaska, he ate some tainted crab, and by the time he got to California, he was very sick and died of food poisoning. So he had a short presidency. Amazingly, a lot of the scandals that I mentioned about the love child and Teapot Dome were not fully understood until after his death. So when he died, he was a very, very popular president, one who had brought peace, prosperity, and stability to the country, which is exactly what people wanted right after World War I. So his body was put on a train all the way from the West Coast to the East Coast, and throughout the country, millions of people were lined up at the tracks crying that they had lost what they thought was the best president ever to run the United States. The crowd tends to be fickle, and nowadays historians think of him as maybe the worst ever. I guess the truth is somewhere in between. The rule when the president dies, obviously, that the vice president becomes president, and that's how you got Calvin Coolidge becoming president in 1923, then re-elected in his own right in 1924, and decided not to run again in 1928. If you think that Harding did little, well, Coolidge did even less. He was kind of a dour figure, came from the northeastern corner of the United States next to Canada, and he was famously a man of few words, which is kind of rare for politicians. Usually politicians love to make speeches and have people hear them talk. Coolidge, it was always a struggle for him. In fact, there's a famous anecdote where a woman came to see him and told him, I made a bet with my lady friends that I could make you say 3 words. I know you're a man of few words, Mr. President, but for sure I can make you say 3 words. And his answer was, you lost. At least he had a sense of humor. Another anecdote is that he had married a lady who was a teacher for the deaf, and his pickup line, I don't know if he used Tinder or whatever app he used, but here's a pickup line. If you can make deaf people hear, maybe you will make a mute person speak. Apparently it worked. As president, he famously did little and specifically slept a lot. His typical day would look like that. Sleep until maybe 9 a.m., mosey on to the office around 10, break for coffee for half an hour, then retire at noon for a 3-hour lunch, and then you take a 2-hour nap, stop by the office again at 5 p.m., ask if there's any work to be done. No, Mr. President, and so you retire for an early dinner and then call it a day and go to bed. He slept more in office than any other president, something like 12 hours a day. In part, this might have reflected some personal problems. Apparently, he lost a child, and usually when you sleep a lot, it's a sign of depression, clinical depression. So that might have been the case, undiagnosed depression. But also, it is the fact that he was a conservative Republican who thought that the government should do little and let private enterprise do its magic. And that's it. Let's do little in office. If you think the Republicans do little in the 20s, wait till you hear about the Democrats, because they are out of office and very, very divided in that period. Traditionally, the Democratic Party has been a big tent party that is home to various competing interest groups, and that's especially true in the 1920s when the party was divided between 2 groups that had very little in common except for sharing the same label of Democrats. The Democratic Party back then was very, very strong in the South. And I know it's quite different from today, where the Republican Party tends to be dominant, but that was true from the time of the Civil War up until the 1960s. Maybe pause the video for a second and ask yourself how come the Democratic Party was strong in the South after the Civil War? And the answer would be that the person who fought on the Union side, President Lincoln, and the advocate of the emancipation of the slaves, was a Republican. And so that meant for conservative white segregationists in the South, the Republican Party was anathema. So they would be solid Democrats, at least if you're white. Black people back then used to be very Republican, though in the South they were often prevented from voting. And that remained the case up until the 1960s, where Lyndon Johnson, a Democrat, passed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which kind of ended segregation in the South. And as a result, a lot of conservative whites fled from the Democratic Party, and that's why now many of them will be conservative Republicans. And you have kind of the opposite exodus among black voters, where they left the Republican Party to join the Democratic Party in the South. But getting back to the 20s, conservative white Southerners are voting Democratic. They'll never vote for the party of Lincoln. So what are their political views? Well, they tended to be dry, because this is the era of prohibition. Alcohol is prohibited. In their religion, they tended to be Protestant, Baptist, Evangelical, Pentecostal, and so forth. Often anti-Catholic. KKK was quite strong in the 1920s, and it is violently anti-Catholic. And they tended to be located in more rural areas of the South, and you had back then fairly few large cities in the South. At the very same time, the other big stronghold of the Democratic Party would be in the cities of the Northeast, places like, say, New York, or Cleveland, or Pittsburgh. The views of the Democrats in those areas were quite different. Many of them are more ethnic in their background. They are Irish Americans, Italian Americans, and they sure like to have a bit of whiskey or beer or wine with their dinner, so they would be typically wet. They want the repeal of prohibition. And their views are more liberal. They are descendants of the progressive branch of the party, so they want to use the government to do things to change society. So on about every point, they are at opposite extremes of the political spectrum, and yet somehow they have to agree. That could create some issues when you want to pick a national candidate, as is the case for a president, and you have to somehow bridge all these differences. That was especially notable in 1924 when the Democrats met for a convention, the time when they picked their candidate, and they had to figure out somebody who would be amenable to the right and to the left branch of the party. The more northern, wet liberal branch wanted to nominate a man from New York. Al Smith was an Irish American, wet, and that would make him anathema to people from the South, who preferred another guy called McAdoo, who was a white segregationist, conservative, dry, anti-Catholic, and people in the North did not like him. So you kind of a replay of the Civil War right there in the party. So they voted, and I think back then you needed a 2/3 majority to be elected, so it's kind of difficult to gather up a majority. And they voted twice, and 3 times, and 10 times, and 20 times, and that convention that was supposed to last a couple of days just dragged on, and all the journalists were reporting that we're now at vote 50, or 60, or 80, and eventually it went into the 30 digits, and by vote 103, the Democrats finally picked a candidate who was quite bland. John Davis was his name. He even had a bland name. And his main claim to fame was that he had no big idea about anything. At least he was not on the record as having supported this or that option. And that made him a good compromise candidate for all the Democrats, who on top of that were probably eager to get back home after 103 votes. So he was a Democratic candidate that year, and since you know that Coolidge was reelected, you know that he went down to defeat and then went back to obscurity. And now that candidate John Davis is more of a footnote in US history, known for being an unsuccessful candidate in the 24 election, and that's about it. So typically the Democrats are in a period of a slump. They lost the next election in 28, so have to wait until the 30s and the presidencies of Franklin D. Roosevelt before the Democrats are very active again. Another movement that had been quite important before would be the progressive movement. And when we talked about Teddy Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, this was their heyday when they are dominant, either as part of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, or in the case of 1912, Teddy Roosevelt tried to run as a third-party candidate as part of the Bull Moose Party. Well, after World War I, the progressives went into an eclipse in the sense that people are quite upset with how extensive government intervention had been in World War I. For example, banning the consumption of alcohol, or nationalizing the railroad, or limiting what people have to say. And in a way, World War I marked both the high water mark of the progressive era in that a lot of their objectives are achieved, but also a backlash among a more general, more conservative population. And so the progressives by the 1920s are far less powerful. The most famous progressive that period was a man called La Follette, and I always love his name because in French you would translate that roughly as crazy little girl, but that was his last name, so let's not point and mark. He was actually a very, very important figure in Wisconsin. There's a whole dynasty there of governors and senators, and he would be the founding father of that dynasty. And he ran for president as a member of the Progressive Party, as an independent third-party candidate in the 1920s. Got something like 15-20% of the vote, which was far from enough to be elected president. Typically, to be a third party in American politics is not successful. It's difficult to break the logjam, and we'll see that time and time again in 20th century politics. So the progressives kind of went into an eclipse, disappeared from the scene at least until the 1930s, when they come back in a big way as part of the New Deal. So that's kind of the story of politics in the 1920s. Not too impressive because, well, people who are in power are Republican presidents who want the government to do little. Warren Harding first, Calvin Coolidge next, and I have not mentioned the third of the lot, and that would be Herbert Hoover, elected in 1928, a one-term president. We'll get back to him when we get to the Great Depression. Well, I'm going to stop here. We still have to cover quite a bit more about the 1920s, in that case what happens outside of Washington, D.C., and that's where the true excitement is in the 1920s. Au revoir, and see you next time.